Thank you, His Excellency, for giving time for this interview. I'd like to start with the developmental issue. I think Australia's main engagement with Myanmar appears to evolve around the important developmental assistance programs. Can you tell us how this is progressing?
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. Australia's got a fairly large development assistance program in Myanmar. Most of it, the lead is in the education sector. That's where we contribute the most. And Australia is the largest bilateral donor in the education sector. That's very much focused on improving both access and quality of education. So things like teacher training, curriculum, the school stipends program. The second area of our aid program is we call governance, and that's supporting things like strengthening institutions, assistance we provided during the elections to the Union Electoral Commission to ensure the elections were carried out efficiently. We call within our governance program. The third area is in supporting the peace process, because without peace there won't be development. So the two are very much linked, economic development and peace. And there, of course, we're not a party to the peace process, but we are supporting the participants in peace. So they're the three main areas, but we also have a humanitarian program, and that's focused on providing assistance to people in conflict-affected and disaster-affected areas. Some of them in internally displaced people camps, and some of them are on the border with Thailand in refugee camps as well. But also, under the humanitarian program comes our assistance, for example, following the flooding last year in August 2015. We call that humanitarian assistance.
So what did you do when the flood was there? Yeah.
As soon as the government requested assistance from international partners, we had what's called family kits, individual boxes which contained basic items for hygiene and for personal hygiene, and items for children, blankets, in individual boxes which were in our warehouse facilities, which we have in Southeast Asia. Were quickly put on board an Australian Air Force plane and were on the ground here very rapidly, and then transported from Yangon up to the flood-affected areas.
Yeah. When looking at the development, what do you think of the main sort of challenges that Myanmar has been facing?
There are many challenges, but if you ask what the main one is, I think it's what we call human capacity, and that is the educational and skills of the population. And that indeed is why we focus very much on education in our development assistance program. Because without an educated workforce, it's very difficult to achieve anything. It's very difficult for businesses to grow if they do not have a skilled workforce. It's very difficult for the institutions of the state, whether it be the courts, the universities, the hospitals, the Human Rights Commission, government ministries and departments. All these institutions, it's important that they function well, but they all require educated people, specialists in their fields. So strengthening what we call the human capacity is critical for business and it's critical for government, and both government and business need to be strong going forward.
Is there any university to university ties or educational ties between Australia and Myanmar in terms of university to university cooperation?
Yes, there is particularly strong ties between the Australian National University, which is based in Canberra, and Yangon University. They have a memorandum of understanding. But other universities too have developed linkages with universities here. It's growing very much. I think even in the year that I have been here in Myanmar, I've seen an increase in the connections between the universities. But also through the aid program, we have a scholarship program that helps to build ties. We have a number of scholars studying every year in Australia from Myanmar. And the MOU which the Australian National University has with Yangon University is not just academic to academic, but it's also looking at university administration and how to strengthen that.
You have seen the November elections. So how do you view the result of the November election and also the success of Daw San Suu Kyi and her party in the elections?
A number of international donors, including Australia, were assisting the Union Electoral Commission in different ways. Australia's support was focused very much on the polling station officer training, developing a training manual and then rolling out that training to all parts of the country so that the polling stations functioned effectively. Through that assistance, through the assistance of the union government and other donors, I think we're pleased with the way the elections were conducted, and it's clear that the voice of the people was heard, and Australia, like other countries, respects the voice of the people. We look forward to working with a new government as it takes office.
You have been here for a while, for like nearly 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. How do you see the challenges that Myanmar is facing in the transition to democracy?
Well, the challenges are many. I mean, we've mentioned the human capacity, that's one. The peace process is another significant challenge. A nationwide ceasefire agreement has been signed with some of the parties, but not all of the parties. It is important for that process to continue, and I think to proceed fairly quickly if the parties are comfortable with that. Because, as I mentioned, there is no development without peace, particularly in those conflict-affected areas. Donors and the government would like to deliver more services, more health and education to these areas which haven't been accessible to us because of conflict. And this is affecting the people. So this is a significant challenge. Within the specific area of transition, in all countries, all democratic countries, when there's a change of government, there is a process of transition. And that has challenges, but we have experience in it. And in Myanmar, this is the first time it's transitioning. So I expect there will be new things to be learnt as it goes forward. But I think the spirit is there. We're seeing cooperation from all sides, and I think the international community is also very willing to support the process.
Yeah. What about the role of the military? I'm sure through your defense attaché, you must have been engaging with the military, Myanmar military. How Australia is engaged with the Myanmar military?
It's a fairly limited engagement. It's focused very much on areas like international peacekeeping, emergency response to disasters, and humanitarian assistance. There's no training or combat training, for example. I think as the country moves forward, it's an opportunity to look again at the range of our assistance. We would be particularly keen to contribute to what we call the professionalisation of the military, and that is to say a military that works in the norms of other countries, of international military, very much focused on external security and respecting civilian authority.
Terrorism is a very sort of a hot topic nowadays with concerns in Australia itself. So how you are engaged with Myanmar military in terms of potential or having terrorist threats in the country?
Well, terrorism, of course, is a global problem, and to defeat it, it requires international cooperation. Fortunately, Myanmar hasn't seen international terrorism here in a strong way in recent years, and I think the challenges to the country come much more from the internal conflicts which are continuing. And as I mentioned, we're supporting the peace process. We're not a party to the process, but supporting the participants. And I think that's the way we'll continue to ensure law and order and stability in Myanmar.
I'd like to go into the issue of trade and investment. I think there has been some increase with the bilateral trade between Australia and Myanmar in the last few years. But how much is the interest from the Australian investors who are willing to come to Myanmar? And what are their concerns if they are going to come to Myanmar for investment?
Yes, trade is growing. It's not very strong. Most of Australia's exports are wheat and foodstuffs, and most of Australia's imports from Myanmar are fish and vegetables. But the total bilateral trade is not very strong, and we are aiming to try and grow that as the economies develop. Because it's mutually beneficial. It's the same with investment. Historically, it's been very low, but in 2015 we saw two very significant Australian investments in Myanmar. The first was the granting of a banking license for ANZ. It's one of the foreign banks to get a restricted banking license, and they have now established their branch here in Yangon, and we're very excited to see that happen. The second significant investment is primarily from Woodside Energy, which was successful in bidding for a number of the offshore gas exploration blocks. And they're talking about $500 million in terms of investment. There are a number of other Australian companies that were also successful in bidding for offshore blocks. And so we're seeing quite a strong beginning. So we've gone from almost nothing in terms of Australian investment in Myanmar, jumping to a very high level of investment.
What are the figures like in terms of both trade and investment, and your projections that you would like to sort of have it in next 3-4 years?
The total bilateral trade, goods and services, is around $250 million. That's in both directions. Investment, as I mentioned, is getting close to $1 billion, but not quite there yet. And I think it'll grow going forward. There are other areas, construction-related activities, building products, engineering services, architectural services. The mining is an area which offers enormous potential. Australia has very strong experience in mining in a way which is respectful for local communities and also treats the environment well. And I think there's a demand for that type of mining, quality mining, international best practice in Myanmar. There's a lot to be learnt, and I think Australian companies are willing to share that knowledge and share that experience. The new mining law was enacted last year, and the regulations are currently being drafted. So we'll see what that produces in terms of Australian interest. But I'm hopeful there'll be a growing interest there. Agriculture too, in agribusiness and food processing, farming techniques, are areas where Australia has developed a range of expertise which can be shared with Myanmar.
You mentioned about agriculture. How about like a specific product like winery and dairy? Because where Australia is really, really strong.
We are strong in both those areas and many other areas as well. But Myanmar, of course, has its own dairy industry and wine industry too, so I'm sure there will be opportunities there. They're very much commercially driven. It's not the government that says this is where it shall happen. It's up to the private sector to make the connections. We can facilitate, we can make introductions, but the two business parties really have to come together and work out some arrangement, which is going to be a benefit to both of them to take it forward. It's open markets and open investment enable the connections to be made between the two countries in the private sector.
How about the investment protection agreement between the two countries? Is it in the process, or what do you think of that?
We don't have a bilateral agreement between Australia and Myanmar, but Australia has an agreement with ASEAN, which of course includes Myanmar. And so it's ASEAN, Australia and New Zealand are all connected through a free trade agreement. And the provisions of that govern issues that you're talking about. So there's no need for a bilateral one. It's a regional agreement.
So when you look at Myanmar in the region, how do you see Myanmar? Because it is between the South Asia and Southeast Asia and between the two big neighbors. And how do you see Myanmar in the region? Vice versa, how do you see Australia's role in that particular region?
Well, I think both Myanmar and Australia have an interest in seeing a stable region. It's in our interests. I mentioned to you how important trade and investment is to Australia's economy and growth. Historically, from the beginning, we've been dependent on trade and investment, and that requires a peaceful environment for shipping and also for the markets. So we are keen to see the process of integration in the region continue through a strong ASEAN. and peaceful borders for Myanmar. I think everybody wants that, and that's why through our development assistance program we are supporting the peace process, because we do see it as very important for the country.
You have, I think, been having increased engagement with China, and many Chinese business is also in Australia. So how do you see the growth of both China and India in the region, and the slow shift towards Asia? So how do you see that, particularly Australia's role in the world with the growth of China and India in the region?
The growth of China and India is important for the world. It's also, of course, important for the people. Hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty through the growth that's taking place in China. So we're very pleased to see that. But the growth in China and India also creates an enormous demand for raw materials, which Australia is well placed to supply. So Australia has had over 25 years of continuous economic growth, very strong export performance, and a lot of that has been raw materials going to feed the growth in China's economy, and to a lesser extent, but also to India's economy as well. So we're very pleased to see countries growing and becoming strong, people being lifted out of poverty. We think that's good for the world. We're very happy to see that.
What have been your sort of highlights of your stay here in Myanmar so far?
Well, Myanmar is such a large country. I think one of the great highlights for me has been the opportunity I've had to travel.
You've been traveling quite a
lot. There's still a lot to go as well.
Like what places?
Well, I've been up to Rakhine State, to Sitwe. I've been to Sagaing. I've been to Kachin. I've been to Mandalay. I've been to Tanatari. Of course, I've been many times to Naypyidaw to meet with government people there. I've been to Southern Shan State, and of course I've been to Bagan on holidays. But I've enjoyed travelling for work, and I've also enjoyed having holidays here in Myanmar. I recently had 2 weeks travelling by car, and enjoyed that very much. But some of the greatest memories, the fondest memories, are the simple things, like travelling and then looking for somewhere to eat and going to a Myanmar restaurant and tasting some things I haven't tasted before, and being really pleased and delighted at the freshness of the food and new tastes and new flavours. For example, from outside, before you come to Myanmar, we think of curries. But what I've discovered here are wonderful fresh salads, like ginger salad. And these are less known, I think, outside of the country. And so when one discovers something new, it's always a nice surprise.
I was in your National Day some weeks ago. It was held here in the Australian compound. It was very impressive for me. One, because you were bringing people from different countries and nationals, and that reflect me how Australia was built or how Australia was established. I know that there are many Burmese citizens who were resettled to Australia, who became a part of Australian nation. So what is your view on this nation building with different nationalities coming from different backgrounds? And I'd like you to compare that and what do you think of Myanmar today, especially the process for nation building?
Well, you're right. Australia is a multicultural society. It's been built on accepting people from every country in the world who have come to Australia and have been accepted. We have a fairly straightforward pathway. So once people are accepted into Australia, they come as permanent residents with a lot of entitlements, but also a pathway from permanent residency to citizenship, which is fairly quick and short. And with citizenship comes full rights, including the rights to vote. And I think that process of acceptance has been the key to success. Other things that have helped have been a strong universal education system. So people coming from many different backgrounds have been able to benefit from the education system, and then with education to participate in the economy and to participate in society. It's inclusion is a word, but it's also a process. It's a process of finding ways where people from very different backgrounds can participate in the economy and to participate in society and to make a contribution. And then from that comes the strength, because different people from different backgrounds have different perspectives on issues. They have different skills. And if you can harness that, your economy becomes very strong. So we define our society by inclusion, and that has been, I think, very much the strength of our society. Not Australia alone, other countries too have very strong migration programs and a strong history of inclusiveness and building their economies and their societies on that multicultural background. So it's not a unique phenomenon, but it is a characteristic of Australia. And Myanmar too has many, I think 135 identified ethnic minorities, and the process of including them, I think, is important to similarly bring out the strengths from that diversity.
Is there anything you would like to add into this interview?
Well, Australia has had continuous diplomatic relations with Myanmar since 1952.
For more than 60 years.
For more than 60 years. Australia's been part of the region for more than 60 years. It's not a new phenomenon. It's one of the strengths of Australia, I think, is it can seem like a Western or a European country, but really it is a part of the region. And Australia sees itself as part of the region. We want, going forward, to build on that relationship with Myanmar. We think there are new opportunities as the economy opens up and the civilianization of government takes hold, that we can build that relationship to the mutual benefit of Australia and Myanmar. And my job in the embassy as the Australian ambassador is to contribute to that process, and I'm really looking forward to doing that going forward for the next few years.
Thank you, His Excellency, for the interview.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.